When a corporate engineering division produces a fatally flawed machine, a city's water infrastructure collapses, or a high school hallway becomes a venue for violence, we look at these events and conclude that the people involved simply stopped caring. We label the inaction a crisis of apathy, a failure of individual courage, or a broader moral decay. Take the grounding of the Boeing 737 MAX fleet. The catastrophic design flaws that led to 2 crashes and 346 deaths were not the result of malicious engineers or a company-wide loss of conscience. Inaction in the face of a crisis is rarely about a lack of empathy. Instead, it is a highly rational, calculated response to the immediate environment. In each of these failing environments, the individual on the ground correctly calculates that the personal cost of speaking up, whether that means losing a job, facing physical retaliation, or being ostracized, falls entirely on their own shoulders. Meanwhile, the benefit of that intervention, a safer plane, a functional city, a peaceful school, is diluted among thousands of other people. What we perceive as a moral failing is actually an expected output. Human behavior in a shared system is a direct result of how that system is engineered, not a reflection of individual virtue. In 1968, ecologist Garrett Hardin published a theory to explain this exact dynamic, which he called the tragedy of the commons. He used the metaphor of a shared open pasture to illustrate how commonly held resources are inevitably destroyed. Hardin modeled that any rational actor sharing that pasture will always choose to add another animal to their herd. The individual receives 100% of the financial benefit from that extra animal, while the ecological cost of overgrazing is divided among everyone in the community. When faced with this systemic exploitation, the default human response is to demand that people simply behave better. But Hardin explicitly warned against using appeals to conscience to solve the problem. Relying on guilt operates as a selective filter. It successfully limits the consumption of people who feel a sense of moral obligation, leaving the remaining resources entirely available for those who do not. Structuring a system that requires individuals to consistently act against their own economic or social self-interest is mathematically guaranteed to fail. This same economic logic governs human behavior on a microscopic scale. A high school's social environment is a constructed commons, a shared resource that requires active maintenance to remain safe and functional. To diagnose exactly why this specific social commons collapses when bullying or violence occurs, researchers use the situational model of bystander behavior, or SMB. This diagram maps the cognitive sequence a person must complete before they will intervene. The very first requirement for action is that the observer must notice the incident and accurately define it as a serious problem that requires intervention. This is immediately complicated by ambiguity. Bystanders actively struggle to distinguish genuine abuse from what they perceive as mutual conflict, reciprocal drama, or behavior that the victim might be provoking. If categorized as a threat, the individual must clear the next node, assuming responsibility. They calculate whether it is their place to step in, or if that duty belongs to a teacher, administrator, or someone closer to the victim. Simply recognizing that a person is being harmed is insufficient to generate action. If the individual does not feel a direct, personal ownership over the shared social space, the cognitive sequence terminates here. Even if a student does assume responsibility, they encounter a second set of cognitive filters, known as the theory of planned behavior, or TPB. This framework explains the immense social costs that block a willing bystander from actually moving to act. The first of these new gates is attitudes. In this context, an attitude is the individual's cold, rational evaluation of the likely outcomes of intervening. Data from focus groups shows that adolescents evaluate these potential outcomes as overwhelmingly negative. They calculate the high probability of facing physical danger or simply becoming the aggressor's next target. Next are subjective norms, the individual's perception of what their peers and the surrounding authorities actually expect them to do, regardless of official school policy. This is where the silent majority effect takes hold. When peers tacitly condone abuse by remaining quiet, it reinforces a powerful, unwritten norm of inaction. The intense social penalty of being labeled a snitch easily overrides the abstract desire to help. Finally, the bystander must assess their perceived behavioral control, or self-efficacy. This is their perceived level of social capital and conflict resolution skill, required not just to stop the immediate incident, but to navigate the ongoing retaliation and fallout in the days that follow. This matrix illustrates a severe structural imbalance. The individuals in these hallways are not apathetic. They are paralyzed by a localized system where the costs of stepping forward drastically outweigh the benefits of remaining invisible. The final variables that alter this cognitive calculus are the identities of the people involved. The bystander weighs their own social standing against the target and the perpetrator. Intervening against an aggressor who holds a higher social status or who is older exponentially amplifies the personal risk for the bystander. Furthermore, if the victim belongs to a different social circle, the bystander lacks the protective buffer of their own peer group. Stepping in guarantees total social isolation. The calculation is grim. The devastating social cost of intervening is concentrated entirely on the single person who speaks up. The benefit, a marginally safer school environment, is distributed among hundreds of students who did nothing. This specific social calculus realizes Hardin's tragedy of the commons. It proves sustained inaction is a structural trap, engineered entirely by the environment itself. This exact same calculus scales up to the largest corporate infrastructures in the world. When an aerospace engineer spots a critical safety flaw during production, they process the identical cognitive sequence as the teenager in the hallway. They weigh the subjective norms of their department and the threat of retaliation against the diffuse benefit of passenger safety. In 2001, Boeing moved its corporate headquarters to Chicago, physically and culturally severing the executive leadership from the engineering teams in Seattle. This geographic separation dismantled the shared norms of the engineering commons. The immediate environment reorganized the individual risk and reward matrix, heavily incentivizing aggressive cost-cutting while penalizing those who delayed production for safety concerns. When leadership isolates itself from the operational reality of its workers, the system degrades to a point where reporting a critical problem becomes an act of professional self-sabotage. To fix these systemic collapses, we have to look past Hardin's pessimism and turn to the work of political economist Elinor Ostrom. She developed a framework for managing what she called the urban commons, complex, shared spaces that thrive when properly structured. The core of Ostrom's solution is the concept of the enabling state, or an enabling authority. Rather than simply demanding bravery from individuals, an enabling authority actively intervenes to alter the cost-benefit conditions of the environment. Its function is to protect the person who speaks up by lowering the personal cost of participation. This is achieved through polycentric governance. This design pools power, monitoring, and responsibility among multiple overlapping groups of stakeholders, rather than isolating the risk on one vulnerable person. Effective governance must structurally absorb the risk of action. When the system shields the individual from retaliation, it shifts the rational choice from silence to intervention. Relying on individual heroism to maintain a functional system, whether it is a passenger jet, a city park, or a high school, is a fatal design error. Human behavior is always the direct and inevitable output of a system's architecture and its underlying incentive structures. To solve the collapse of our shared spaces, we have to stop appealing to conscience. We have to start engineering environments where collective action is the only rational choice.